to explore this topic. And by way of introduction, as one thinks of eschatology in Africa, what are the models that we see? Very briefly, the traditional religions would have a very secular kind of eschatology where a person is born and they live a good life, and then after that they die, and when they die, buried, they come back as an ancestor, back to their home. There's a whole ritual in some instances that they do to bring him back to his place, and so he becomes an ancestor that helps the family. And so the irony of this is that men who were irresponsible all of a sudden become good ancestors. So this secular approach to eschatology is very prevalent, not in a few, but in many of the African religions and cultures. And so as we look at eschatology in Adventist and biblical approach, we find a very linear approach where everything has a start in creation, and of course God is eternal, no beginning, but the creation has a start, and then the fall, but things are moving again towards restoration. And this has been the main discussion from most of the presenters here, the restoration of the image of God through health and so on. So we're going to look at eschatology and also look at the nature of health and education as it relates to eschatology. And so as we look at that, I want us to look at the historical background of the Adventist Church, especially around the pioneers and Ellen White, and look at Ellen White's comments on health in context, and also look at Ellen White's comments on education in the context of health education. So those are the main sort of areas we're going to be looking at. So looking at the aftermath of 1844, we know the story of what happened after 1844, or even during 1844. They were waiting for the second coming of Christ. According to their study, 22 October 1844 was the day. And a lot of events that were leading to that caused an excitement among the Millerite believers. Now, there were several groups of people after the disappointment, and we observed that some went back to their churches. They felt that it was a big mistake, and that it was better to go back to their old faith and continue as they did before. There were some who decided it was too embarrassing to go back, and so they decided we will abandon faith altogether. And so they decided no more church. Then there was a group that kept on setting more dates. They kept setting dates about the second coming. And then there was this group that faithfully went back to study again. Where did we go wrong? They went back to look at how they made mistakes and so on. So God's hand was also moving along with them. We are told that one group that met at Hiram Edson's farm, I had a privilege quite a few times to visit that site. We have a properly reconstructed heritage site there of the barn where they met, and it was a barn where the people usually met for worship, for congregating. And so they met in the barn to wait for the second coming, and Christ did not come. So the next morning, as they were taking a walk through the cornfield, it is said that Hiram Edson had a kind of illumination, some call it a vision, of what really was happening, and the text opened up to his mind about the sanctuary. And so this is where now things begin to shape up. And at this time, we do find that the shut door theory had already settled in. So in other words, they were not continuing with preaching anymore, evangelizing. They felt that salvation was decided for those that had accepted the message, and so it was done for them. And as they continued reflecting, it began to open up to them what was happening. And so when we look at pioneers on eschatology, J.N. Andrews strongly emphasized at some point the forgiveness of sins aspect in the high priestly ministry of Christ. And he sort of presented him as standing by the mercy seat, offering his blood, not merely for the cleansing of the sanctuary, but also for the pardon of iniquity and transgression. So J.N. Andrews had already packaged this understanding of eschatology and also the question of salvation. And this would come as the key for the Sabbatarian Adventist open door. So from a shut door to an open door theology, that contrast happened in a very short time, where Adventists were beginning to light up to what was happening. And I have some references there to that. And so we find James White endorsing the work of J.N. Andrews, his study on this idea of open door. We do find that Ellen White also very early in her writings, she was shown a number of things by God, and she began to see light, and also in the light of what God showed her about this open door. So Andrews's work uplifted God's mercy and placed within the context of probationary time and a pre-Advent judgment. There were important features of Seventh-day Adventist eschatology there. So Ellen White herself published around this time 4 volumes of spiritual gifts as we know them, from 1858 to 1864. Now, a number of people have made reference to 1863. It was an important year. One of the things that were a major milestone for the Seventh-day Adventist Church was the formation of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. 1863 was the year. In that same year, Ellen White received her major health vision. So as we look at this period from 1858 to 1864, there was a lot that happened during that period, including this idea of health. And it was not only 1863, by the way, that she received the vision, but earlier on, she had received a vision about tobacco, alcohol, tea and coffee. But the vision she received in 1863 was on a comprehensive scale. The guiding factor for the Seventh-day Adventist Church to really consider very seriously. And it was not until 1858 that Ellen G. White made any statement in reference to an atonement in connection with Christ's ministry after 1844. Now, I want us to see and to have a picture of what was happening this time. The Advent believers, from about 1848 to 1852, they were beginning to shape the movement through study of Scripture. So they were having these Sabbath conferences, and in these Sabbath conferences, a lot of doctrines were shaped. Now, just to take a little tangent and aside here, to illustrate what we're going to see here happening with the Sabbath. As we look at the Sabbath and how it was introduced to the Adventist believers, it was Rachel Oakes, who was a Seventh-day Baptist, who introduced the Sabbath to the to the Millerite Adventists. Now, some resisted the Sabbath idea, including Ellen White at the initial stages, but later on, as it was presented, they began to really go deep into it. But what is interesting is that they did not just appropriate and accept the Sabbath just as a day of worship, but they studied deeply into its theology and how it connected to other teachings. And this is what we see happening. The sanctuary doctrine is not studied as just an isolated doctrine. They study it in tandem with other doctrines to see how these doctrines fit together. And so as they studied the Sabbath, they discovered a number of things, that the Sabbath was not just a day of worship, it also had implications as well in eschatology, because at the end, it was going to be the sign for God's people of the covenant they had with Him. So we see these discoveries and these connections happening during this time. And so as we look at Ellen White's own contribution to the eschatology, she clearly fused the eschatological links with her sanctuary concepts, indicating the extreme importance of Jesus' going into the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary to cleanse it, to make a special atonement for Israel, and to receive the kingdom of his Father, and then return to earth and take them to dwell with him forever. So Ellen White had already started building up on this important doctrine in terms of her writings. And Darmstadt concluded in his book, his book, The Foundations of Seventh-day Adventism, he concludes that Ellen White, in referring to a special atonement, apparently meant an atonement specifically related to the pre-Advent judgment. Now, at this time, the idea of a pre-Advent judgment was not very well known, not by the Millerites or nor by evangelical Christians. It was a completely new idea. And so as the Advent eschatology was shaping up, we see more thought leaders also emerging. So J.H. Waggoner and James White began to write a series of articles. And these articles strengthened the sanctuary doctrine. And some of these articles were written, in actual fact, they complemented each other, and they followed one after the other. It was James White and then Waggoner. James White's series which ran from July 14 to September 8 on the review, was entitled The Sanctuary. And then J.H. Waggoner's series ran from September 8 to December 1 of 1863, same year, and it was entitled The Atonement. So they were beginning to express their understanding of this important discovery, this important truth that they had discovered, and how it was connecting to the things of the end. Now, during the 1860s, the denomination also embraced the health reform message. And what is interesting is that they related this to their eschatology. And that's a very significant point of convergence, where the health message, as I mentioned, it was not just an isolated doctrine, or not even a doctrine, but a vision that was given to Ellen White. They didn't see that in isolation. They saw the health message as something that had a connection with the sanctuary doctrine. So the Adventist pioneers connected health reform, the loud cry of the third angel, the latter rain, the sanctuary doctrine, all together as they studied more and more on this topic. So J.H. Waggoner made the classic statement on health reform, and this is the statement. We do not profess to be pioneers in general principles of health reform. So the statement acknowledges that health reform is not a new thing. It is, something that has been there. But he continues, but we do claim that by the method of God's choice, it has been more clearly and powerfully unfolded. As mere physiological and hygienic truths, they might be studied by some at their leisure. But when placed on the level with the great truths of the third angel's message, by the sanction and authority of God's Spirit, and so declared to be the means whereby a weak people may be strong to overcome, and our diseased bodies cleansed and fitted for translation, then it comes to us as an essential part of the present truth, to be received with the blessing of God or rejected at our own peril. So that was J.H. Waggoner's summary of the discovery of the pioneers, including Ellen White, in this very important doctrine of the sanctuary as it related to the health reform message. Now I'd like us to examine a few statements from Ellen White that help us understand the depth to which she went in trying to unpack this important message, the health message, in a very practical way, and also relating it once again to the end time. And then we see the eschatological elements that come with this important teaching. So as we look at these statements, and drawing from Herbert Douglas in his book Heartbeat of Adventism, it's more like a compilation where he has statement from Ellen White and a little topic that summarizes the statement. And I just want to say something about compilations that you probably all know, that the weakness of compilations is that there are instances where the context may be lost. You may have a good statement, but without the context from which it was drawn, it's very difficult to find a broad idea and understanding of what the import of that statement is in the larger context. So this is a very dangerous ground when you don't have the context, the full context. So it is important to go back to the context. When you read a compilation, go back to the context and see the bigger picture, and then come back to see how the thematic lineup goes and how they fit things together beautifully. And the most beautiful thing with compilations is that they bring together statements from the collection of Ellen White's writings that resonate so well on a theme that you do get a very rich understanding of a theme through this collection of statements. My time is quickly running out, so let me quickly take you through a few of these statements, and then we bring it to a conclusion. Living since 1844 during the antitypical Day of Atonement, God's loyalists, he calls them, have special responsibilities. What is the context here? I found something interesting as I looked at the context, that Ellen White keeps repeating over and over, we must watch and pray. So this is sort of the key thought that runs through as she presents this message. And I think if we take it within that framework, we will have a broader understanding of what she intended. We are in the Day of Atonement. We are to work in harmony with Christ's work of cleansing the sanctuary from the sins of the people. Let no man who desires to be found with a wedding garment on resist our Lord in his office work. As he is, so will his followers be in this world. We must now set before the people the work which by faith we see our great high priest accomplishing in the heavenly sanctuary. Those who do not sympathize with Jesus in his work in the heavenly courts, who do not cleanse the soul temple of every defilement, but who engage in some enterprise not in harmony with this work, are joining the enemy of God and man in leading minds away from the truth and work for this time. So very clearly, Ellen White is giving a stern warning to the people that live in these last days that we are in the Day of Atonement. And she unpacks this to show that the enemy is rife, and we have to be careful. That's why she says, watch and pray, watch and pray. A couple of times she repeats that phrase. And then she shows how important it is to keep a high standard of living. Statement number 2, because of what God is calling for in this special time, we need to know how to care for ourselves physically. Now, the context there that I found very emphatic is that Ellen White is saying our usefulness in God's cause depends on good health. And we have emphasized the idea of good health so well throughout the presentations that were given here. In in Christ Object Lessons, page 346, she says, anything that lessens physical strength and feebles the mind and makes it less capable of discriminating between right and wrong, we become less capable of choosing the good and have less strength of will to do that which we know to be right. And the context there again is that those who thus shorten their lives and unfit themselves for service by disregarding nature's laws. Note that she says nature's laws, and it goes beyond just health laws, but it encompasses all the laws that govern our being, including moral laws, are guilty of robbery towards God. And they are robbing their fellow men also, because they have to minister to their fellow men. The brain nerves that connect with the whole system are the medium through which heaven communicates with men and affects the inmost life. Whatever hinders the circulation of the electric current in the nervous system, thus weakening the vital powers and lessening mental susceptibility, makes it more difficult to arouse the moral nature. She connects the moral nature of man with the physical or violation thereof of the laws, and how those resonate and connect together. And writing in the 19th century, definitely these were far from being discovered, and yet God revealed to her these important insights about how the human the human being operates. So the third statement here, the Adventist health message is designed to prepare a people for the return of Jesus. I think that's a very, very important goal. And in Testimonies, Volume 3, page 161, health reform is one branch of the work which is to fit a people for the coming of the Lord. It is as closely connected to the third angel's message as the hand is with the body. Had men ever been obedient to the law of the Ten Commandments, carrying out in their lives the principles of those precepts, the curse of disease now flooding the world would not be. He has permitted the light of health reform to shine upon us, that we may see our sin in violating the laws which He has established in our being. He who cherishes counsels on diets and foods, he who cherishes the light which God has given him upon health reform, has an important aid in the work of becoming sanctified through the truth and fitted for immortality. This is only 3 of the 10 statements that are put together to establish this connection between the eschatology, the sanctuary doctrine, and the health message. And then the final statement I want to present relates to education. And I'll explain in a bit why I chose to say something about education. Our ideas of education take too narrow and too low a range. There is need for a broader scope, a higher aim. True education means more than a pursual of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and with the whole being and with the whole period of existence possible to man. It is the harmonious development of the physical, the mental, the spiritual powers. It prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and for the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. And I'd like to contextualize this statement in the context of health education. Ellen White is talking about education in general here, but we have been talking about education in general, health in general, and I would like us to see the importance of educating ourselves and also educating our people in preparation, not only for this earth, but for the world to come. And in conclusion, this short study has shown how our early pioneers demonstrated a synergy between eschatology and health. Education also has similar dimensions that have been explored extensively, not necessarily in this study. So health education should have the same eschatological focus today. So as we look at and explore the application of this health education and living it out is not only for this earth. And today, there are many health conscious people. In the media, you find people in the gym all the time eating good food. So there is a strong interest in health and healthfulness. But ours is not just for this earth. It is also for the world to come and in preparation for that. So I await your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sokupa, for this wonderful insights that you delivered this evening. So we have a couple of minutes for some questions. Please open questions, raise your hand. Dr. Oberhoster, please. We have some microphone here.
Thank you very much for the interesting and very good presentation linking these things, Dr. Michael Sokupa. I have a question, and it came to my mind as I looked at Waggoner's quotation that you had up there. When we start talking about people preparing their bodies for the second coming, this somehow starts smelling or referring to some kind of legalism. At least that's the way it's seen by many people. Even when we start linking health reform and sanctification, this can easily be seen as legalism. Trying to do these things, trying to get ready to go to heaven just by living healthfully. How do you respond to that? How do you see this? Is this something that, how would we respond to people that come with accusations of this is legalism?
Thank you. I think you've touched on a very, very important subject. And it's not only bordering on legalism in some people's minds, it also borders on perfectionism, where people believe that we have to be perfected to get ready for translation. So this body. So as we look at those thoughts, yes, it is something that goes through people's minds, and sometimes it can be taken to extremes, where people are doing health reform on their own strength to prepare for heaven. But I think in this case, it is connected to the work of Christ, or in the sanctuary. So as we look at the work of Christ in the sanctuary, he is working not only for us, but he's also working in us. So it is not only our work, but it is his work in us, in preparing us for his kingdom. And I think as we have looked at the whole question of health, and the way Ellen White has presented it, particularly in some of the statements we have looked at, it seems to be something that affects our whole being. Because if we don't adhere to some of the health, nature laws that God has put for our being, we find that it affects a number of other areas in our lives. It affects the mental, it affects the spiritual, the moral, all because we have faltered in an area. So I think balance is needed in terms of our way of thinking and understanding. and also presenting these things so that it is not presented as a doctrine on its own. Because the mistake that many people have made in this area is to make it a doctrine on its own. But here we have seen a synergy of not only the health message, but also the whole eschatology, Adventist eschatology, and how it fits together in terms of God's plan and his work.
Have time for another question? Yes. The last, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug, for your presentation. I would like to know, where do you place Ellen White's eschatology? Is it for the future, the end, or the final end? Or it is a transition that goes along even onto the new heavens and the new earth?
Thank you for the question. It's also a good one. As you look at Adventist eschatology, you will remember that in 1844 they were expecting Christ to come. So their minds were sort of focused on the second coming. And they discovered, no, it was not the second coming. Christ was going into the most holy place according to the antitypical system. So in looking at that, already it places the remnant church in that period of the time of the end. So you have that period already kicking in from the early development of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So Ellen White had a number of visions and also interacted with the believers who were engaging Scripture in trying to understand these events of the last days. And they had in mind something that was happening in their time, and it continues until the end.
Wonderful. I think the time is over. So thank you so much once again, Dr. Sokupa, for this wonderful presentation.
Stigma discrimination.
As we move on to our final presentation for the evening, we once again welcome to stage Dr. Alexis Laguno. I know that people keep joining and some maybe have not attended previous presentations. Dr. Laguno is a native of the Philippines, but he has worked and served in Africa for the past 37 years in the areas of health, and currently the Executive Director of Adventist International AIDS Ministries, and is talking about something that is very much related to this particular area. It could also apply to other areas on the issue of stigmatization or stigma. So, Dr. Laguno, may the Lord use you tonight so that we see the light.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming back, and thank you for the opportunity once again to be able to address this audience, giving me the opportunity to serve here in the Philippines. This is a continuation of my discussion which I had early in the morning about the HIV pandemic and the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. How come that the General Conference decided to come up with an office, particularly with the disease. And this morning we actually discussed that it is because of the distortion of sexuality that is going on, and HIV actually is a reflection on the attack on the sexuality that God has made, and we had expounded about that. And the second reason for this is because of what they call stigma and discrimination, okay? Now, I'm so glad that you have actually the topic health and wholeness. Sorry, that slide is cut there. stigma and discrimination. And I think it is very important for us to be able to discuss about stigma and discrimination because, like it or not, all of us have some form of stigma or discrimination. In some ways, we were programmed when we were still small. The perception of our parents are handed down to us,